It is now my distinct honor to introduce our keynote conversation for the evening. This is an embodiment of the mission that I just shared with you, and I hope you thoroughly enjoy it. We are very fortunate to have with us this evening Lawrence H. Summers, a distinguished leader whose influence on global economic policy and academia have been immense. As the former president of Harvard University, Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, and Director of the National Economic Council, Larry has had a profound impact on shaping our understanding of economics, business, and business's role in society. His insights continue to shape the way we think about markets and their role in addressing global challenges. Moderating this conversation is Curt Nickisch, Senior Editor at Harvard Business Review and a proud MBA alumnus of Questrom School of Business, not to mention a former student of mine. Curt's journalistic enterprise and expertise and his deep understanding of business and business leadership ensure that this discussion will be both engaging and thought-provoking. Please welcome Lawrence Summers and Curt Nickisch.
Can I just say something before we get into this? I was so excited when Mike Salinger called and asked me if I would be willing to participate in this event. And I really was excited at the chance. And I'll tell you why. It's actually very personal for me. My mother, who died at the age of 98, just a year ago, was a professor for some years at the Wharton School. And she did many different things. But the thing of which she was most proud was inaugurating a business and public policy program and a set of business and public policy courses at a time when that just wasn't a thing that happened in business schools in the early 1980s. And she said that she didn't see how complicated business enterprises could function intelligently if they didn't understand the broader society in which they were needing to operate and the forces and the considerations that went into public policy. And God knows, when I was in government, I saw how right that was when all kinds of business leaders would come in and they would say, well, you should do X. And I would say, why? And they would say, well, you should do X. I'm a CEO. And I didn't find that a very persuasive argument, and because they didn't actually understand anything about my problem. And the other thing my mother always used to explain was, and I also saw this in some administrations of which I was a part, that you weren't going to make economic and government policy very well. You weren't going to be a nonprofit leader very well if you didn't understand business and you didn't think about how to catalyze business to your purposes. And so it was central to having a successful society that business have a place, that it not be the only place, and that there be a set of people and a set of ideas about how business and the broader society relate. And that was really extraordinarily important work to do. It's the work she did, and I'm very proud of the work that she did. But there's an immense amount to do, and that was why I was so excited when I heard about your vision, Ravi, and what it has resulted in here at BU. I think there's an enormous potential for work in this area to really make a very, very great contribution. And so congratulations from me to everybody who's involved, and I'm really honored to have a chance to be part of this.
It's such a rich topic. We could begin almost anywhere, but I do want to bring your attention to the fact that you can scan this QR code up here and pose a question. So we have a certain number of minutes. I can carry on this conversation, but I'd love to bring you into the conversation in your questions as much as possible. So please go ahead and ask a question for Larry early, ask often, and I will do my best to bring it into the flow of the conversation. Larry, it's such a great moment, right, to be, we're celebrating this fabulous institute with an ambitious and meaningful agenda at a time when a lot of people out there are, we're also sitting in this room that capitalism built, in a way, looking over a city that capitalism built. But we're at a time when a lot of young people especially question the power of it, the need for it. A lot of people are disillusioned. Should they be?
Look, we can always do better. And there's no greater enemy of progress than complacency. And so I don't ever want to live in a country of fully satisfied people. And I don't want to ever live in a country where young people don't think they can do better than their parents' generation did. But I do think that the case for capitalism, the case for business, hasn't been made with sufficient vigor. And I want to tell you a story about an experience I had that really got me thinking about one aspect of capitalism in a way I hadn't before. And it was kind of an unlikely, when I tell it, it was really very unlikely that from this experience, that I'd have any thoughts about economics. About a year ago, a friend of mine, good friend of mine, is involved in the group that owns the Washington Commanders football team. And the Washington Commanders were playing the Patriots. And so his ownership group was coming up to see the Patriots game. And the Commanders apparently are going to build a stadium. And so they got a tour from members of the Kraft family that owns the Patriots and talk about all the lessons the Kraft family had learned as they had built the stadium where the Patriots play. And it was quite remarkable to listen to the Krafts talk. They used the word guests to refer to the 65,000 people who came every day. They were obsessed with the comfort of the experience. The angle of the seat backs, the speed with which you can get in and out of the concessions, the nature of the foods that were served, the different levels that you could get to, the elaborate re-engineering study they had done that reduced the amount of time that the average person needed to get out of the parking lot after a game by 6 minutes. There they were, billionaires who owned a football team, devoting extraordinary mental energy to sucking up and making happy a bunch of middle-class people who they were never going to know who came to the games. They were obsessed with making those people happy. Not a bit of it was because they had a charitable impulse. 100% of it was the better they made that experience, the higher the prices they could charge and still fill the stadium. And so their desire to succeed drove them to do it incredibly. And all I could think about as I listened to them describe it was, suppose this was a municipally owned football team. Was there any chance that the stadium would be 1/10 as comfortable? Was there any chance that the bathrooms would be as clean? Was there any chance that the concessions would be as good? And that is a really powerful thing about markets, competition, and capitalism, that they drive people to do the best for the masses. A former colleague of mine, he died a few years ago, Marty Weitzman, had, I think, one of the most profound insights I've ever heard about capitalism. He said the difference between capitalism and communism is that in capitalism, the sellers suck up to the buyers. Think about how nicely they greet you when you walk into an automobile dealership. Think about how elaborately designed a grocery store is to make you happy. That's the way it works in capitalism. In communism, you have to suck up to the butcher if you want to get the meat, because there's not going to be enough. And so there is a overwhelming force that markets generate that is positive towards making people happy, and that has a profoundly egalitarian aspect. It's not other people sucking up to the crafts so they can get a ticket. It's the crafts who are billionaires sucking up to thousands of people. And that's a really powerful and positive aspect of capitalism that I think we take for granted, and that anyone who's lived in a planned economy, anyone who ever spent any time, everybody, you can't do it anymore, but when you did the incredible natural experiment, which I'm old enough to have done, of walking through Checkpoint Charlie from East Berlin to West Berlin, you saw in an instant. And that is basically the place. Look, there's a million things we're going to talk about, market failures, greed, a million things to talk about how to make capitalism better. But the basic idea that markets drive people to make their customers happy, and their customers are everybody. And by the way, it's the same thing with your workers. BU wants to get good professors. If BU makes it crappy to be a professor, they're not going to be able to get good professors. Do professors want money? Do professors want bigger offices? Do professors want changes in their teaching load? Every incentive that BU has is to figure out how to configure a package that works well for professors within their constraints. Or put it a different way, if I was a steel company, I was a steel factory, and you were the central planner, what would you say I was supposed to do to make the biggest contribution to society? Well, you wouldn't just want me to produce the most output, because you'd kind of want me to produce more output than input. So you'd kind of say, well, we should figure out how much output I get, figure out how much the output is worth, and then we should figure out how much inputs I have to use, and we should figure out how much they're worth, and we should subtract the cost of all the inputs from the cost of all the outputs, revenue from all the outputs, and we should maximize that. Well, there's a name for revenues minus costs. It's called profits. And so what is it a planner would want? Maximizing profits. What is it that a market economy does? It maximizes profits. And so I think that core idea is an important part of why I believe so strongly in market economies. And there's another core idea that I think is very important that I always say in the first class of every course I teach that's about economics. I do some version of this, and people never know quite what to do about it. I say to them, do you think that consenting adults should be able to do whatever they want in a bedroom without laws that stop it or try to control it? And they all say yes. I said, okay. How about in a marketplace? How about if I want to loan Mike Salinger money and he wants to take the money and I think I'm better off lending him the money, and he thinks he's better off borrowing the money. Do you think we should have a bunch of rules that mess with that contract? Not sure we should. And that if you believe in freedom, an important part of freedom is freedom to enter into exchanges. Now, that doesn't mean that if you do something in a bedroom that affects people in a profound way who are outside the bedroom, that maybe somebody shouldn't pay attention. And there's some kinds of exchanges that have huge consequences for third parties. But again, these core virtues of markets, and I think the economics profession doesn't talk about it this way. They say, well, it's optimal to have marginal this equal marginal that, and this be tangent to that and the other thing, and that's all true. But there's a deeper, more philosophical case, which is why I'm hugely a believer in markets as a central way of organizing society.
I think that in politics, this is what they call throwing red meat to the classical economists in the audience. The one question we got is capitalism even a helpful term to be using? You know the surveys of people who think capitalism are good or not in the U.S. Is capitalism a helpful term to use when we really talk about the role of business in society? Does it get people off on the wrong track?
I don't know. I mean, I'm a economist, not a jingle writer. I tend to use the word market economy more often than I use the word capitalism, kind of because I think the word capitalism's come to have some slightly unfortunate connotations. But, look, Winston Churchill said about democracy, it's a long way from a perfect system, but it's better than all the alternatives. And I think that's the kind of question you have to ask about it. And if you look around the world today, look at what's happened. Look at East Germany and West Germany. Look at North Korea and South Korea. The natural experiments point fairly strongly towards more market-oriented economies. Now, that doesn't mean there isn't a huge amount to debate between, the economics of Ronald Reagan and the economics of Barack Obama, the economics of Sweden and the economics of America. There's plenty to debate about within the broad confine of a market-oriented society with a role for government. But I think you have to start from what an extraordinary engine of progress, progress and freedom and equality and emancipation markets are.
You brought up maximizing profits. We're 5 years since the Business Roundtable put out their pledge that the purpose of corporations was to take stakeholders like suppliers, employees, communities into account, not just solely shareholders for shareholder value maximization. What do you make of that? And I should also say not a lot has changed since. It's not like boards have changed bylaws. Companies have used stakeholder as a term in their financial reporting. There haven't been huge, obvious, ramifications of that. But I'm just curious. It is like for somebody who's not doesn't come up with a jingle. It is a new term. It is a new way of talking about capitalism, and I'm curious what you make of it and where you see it going.
you know, as between Milton Friedman, who basically says, shareholders, 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 if you're not paying attention to shareholders, you're being a goofball and it's immoral and you're wrong.
And that also answers the social.
As between the Milton Friedman view of this and the mushhead view of this, that profits are bad and, you know, we should work for the workers and the customers and we should just kind of work for everybody and do the general good, I'd say I'm on Milton Friedman's 25-yard line. I'm not all the way to where he is, but I'm pretty far in that direction. Why do I say that? Number one, because of what I said before. Isn't it a good idea to maximize the value of your outputs minus the value of your inputs? And if you're doing something other than that, then you're deciding not to maximize the value of your output minus the value of your inputs, and why would you want to do that? Now you might say, well, I've got some outputs that aren't being counted, and like I pollute the air and that's a bad, and those should be counted. And in general, I think there's something to that. Whether simply putting business CEOs in charge of doing that balancing or having laws and rules that internalize those externalities, I'm a little more in favor of laws and rules rather than trust the CEO and trust the board as a way of doing it. I think the second thing is that I've kind of noticed something in life, which is that accountability is a really good thing. And it's easier to be accountable with a clear objective. I'll bet that the academic leaders here, Bob Brown's been like involved in running things in universities for more or less forever, and I have a feeling he'll agree with what I'm about to say. At one level, it kind of seems like a great idea to say that Professor X is in school A and in school B, and maybe also affiliated with school C. And often that's good, and it's a good way of exploiting his or her many talents and expertise and interests, and that's good. On the other hand, when Professor X is absent from school A, he can say he's at school B, and when he's absent from school B, he can say he's at school A, and if he can actually be on the golf course rather than in either place. And it's like the first rule. The first thing they explained to me when I got, one of the first things they explained to me when I got to the government was that it was really good to report to 3 people. Because if you reported to 3 people, you weren't really reporting to anybody, because you could just do what you wanted and say to anyone who didn't like it that it was because one of your other bosses told you to do it. And so, in general...
Well, you get three times as much professional development that way, too.
Well, that may be. But so in general, when you say that you're accountable for a lot of different things, it tends to be really hard to figure out whether you did a good job or a bad job. And when it's really hard to figure out whether you did a good job or a bad job, people are a little more likely to slack off. And so this stakeholder stuff framed diffusely makes me nervous. That's the second problem. The third reason why I'm kind of skeptical about it is that a lot of the people who are for it are really for it because they don't want to get regulated or taxed. Just leave it to us. We'll take care of it. We'll take care of it. The environment, poverty, we'll just do it. It's like a completely standard thing. Some business, and when I was president of Harvard, I used to get mad because I always thought the Harvard Business School was a little credulous on this stuff. But some business would be like stealing the Treasury blind, using abusive, outrageous tax shelters. And then they'd put $400,000, they'd steal billions of dollars by tax sheltering, and then they'd put $800,000 into a charter school. And then they'd make a video about their charter school. And then they'd come and want to be celebrated as great moral heroes who'd stood up for the stakeholders.
In the correct congressional district.
So I think a certain amount of this, a certain amount of the enthusiasm for stakeholders is so you have a story with which to resist regulation. On the other hand, I think there are other cases where there is a case. I mean, I am actually, one of the things that I'm preoccupied with right now is I recently joined the board of OpenAI. OpenAI, they're the people who bring you ChatGPT. We've now brought you a really quite sophisticated reasoning system just as a test. They have a system where they say they can give you an opinion about the probability of anything. And just to kind of test it out, I put in the name of a couple people I knew, and I said, how likely is it that X will win a Nobel Prize? And it gave a percentage, and it wrote a rather thoughtful essay defending its view as to the percentage. So this thing's really getting pretty good. Well, you know, how should that be kind of run? Right now, there was a structure set up where there's a not-for-profit company that is really the thing, and that it has a subsidiary, which is a for-profit company. That's got a variety of issues, and so we're thinking about the appropriate structure, but the appropriate structure for an institution charged with that is not, let's just everybody make as much profits as they possibly can as quickly as they can. I think it's probably a good thing that BU is not a for-profit institution, because it would be led to a variety of behaviors as a for-profit institution that wouldn't serve its mission optimally. So I think you have to think about the mission and all that, but I think this general diffuse, it sounds nice to be for all the stakeholders, that when you look at it more deeply, runs into a certain number of problems.
Yeah. I like the skepticism. I like the skepticism of the dotted line, too. I'm going to remember that. One question we have here kind of ties into this, and that's they ask about the role of alternate corporate forms in the economy, such as social purpose corporations, co-ops, nonprofits, those kinds of things. Do you like that system? It's a growing world as a place for people to make those decisions about inputs and outputs differently and come up with something that works for.
Look, in general, it seems to me if you believe in a market economy, and you believe in contracting, there should be a lot of different ways that people are allowed to contract and should be allowed to organize themselves, and you should let different organizational forms compete, and you should see which ones kind of win out and which ones survive. And roughly, the public policy shouldn't try to decide the answer to that question, but it should try to let competition decide the answer to that question. You know, I think there's certainly a case for so-called benefit or social purpose corporations when you're dealing with things that are extremely sensitive in some way, so that you don't have an excessively strong profit motive driving into bad behaviors, and you may well be able to get better licenses from society if you're not seen as maximizing profit. If somebody wants to start a for-profit competitor to BU, I think it's fine for somebody to start it. I don't have a feeling they won't get very far, but maybe I'll turn out to be wrong. If somebody wants to start a mutual or a co-op, I think that's fine. I think there's some things that economists understand that are helpful in thinking about this. The problem with co-ops is that if it's a co-op where kind of everybody shares the profits, there isn't a very strong incentive to grow, because even if the cost of having one more person is they could have produced 5 units of output on the side, if you've got 10 people now and they each produce 100, and they each produce 10 units of, then you produce 100 units of output, and each person gets 9, then suppose you can hire one more person, and that one more person will produce 9 units of output. Well, that's kind of a good thing for society to do, because you've moved somebody from producing 5 to producing 9. But from the point of view of the co-op, each person used to get 100 divided by 10, and now they're going to get 109 divided by 11. And so they're all sort of disincentivized to do it. So to say something sort of controversial, it's been my view that our leading universities are basically our co-ops in important ways, run by their faculties, and that they have substantially failed the world by insufficiently expanding. And so I always think that a question that I think a university should ask itself, I'm overstating this for effect, but is, should it have the Coca-Cola mentality or the Augusta mentality? What's the Augusta Golf Club mentality? We are going to define our greatness by how exclusive we are. We are going to be so great, everybody's going to want to be part of us, and hardly anybody's going to get to be part of us. And so we're really going to seem extremely special, unique, and cool. What's the Coca-Cola mentality? We want everybody to be involved. Universities, if you think about it, tend to the Augusta mentality. Can you imagine in a market economy any institution that was as successful as MIT being the same size in its most fundamental product line as it was 50 years ago? That would not happen in any other sector. But it happens because of the particular sets of incentives that are generated, of which a very important one is a not-for-profit kind of controlled by the incumbents, incumbent key workers very heavily. So basically, I think we should have a lot of organizational forms. We should experiment with organizational forms. I don't think it's a particularly good idea for the government to go way out of its way to try to tilt the playing field by giving special tax breaks for this form or that form. But I think that's roughly how I think about the question.
Yeah, no, you gave us a lot to think about there. Let's go back to AI. You're on the board of OpenAI. How big of a technology is it? I mean, you've seen the internet. Your grandmother, who you spoke about before, she lived through electricity, these other technological disruptions. How fast is it going to happen, do you think, from your perspective, and how quickly are some of these social?
Since you mentioned my grandmother, let me kind of put a big picture on this.
Yeah.
My grandmother was born in 1900. She died in 1973. She lived to be 73. I'm almost 70, so roughly equivalent lifespans. What happened during my grandmother's lifetime? Outdoor plumbing to indoor plumbing, candlelight to electric light, horse and buggy to cars to airplanes, no control of the heat or cool inside where you lived, to heating and air conditioning, people carrying messages to the telephone, to the radio, to the television. Child death being something that happened in most families, to child death being something that was quite extraordinary. All that, and I could make a bunch more examples, talking about food, talking about entertainment, and so forth, happened in her lifetime.
And society managed.
And what happened in my lifetime? Well, the world's a much better place, much richer place. You wouldn't have windows that size. In 1954, you wouldn't have a ceiling this high. You couldn't have quite built this building. In 1954, certainly we wouldn't have had phones in our pockets. When I was born, we wouldn't have been able to use a computer. There weren't any Kindles. But if you compare the change that's taken place during my lifetime with the change that took place during my grandmother's lifetime, my lifetime much, much less. What about I had my first granddaughter who was born 3 months ago. What about the change that's going to take place during her lifetime? I think it's possible that it's going to be more like during my grandmother's lifetime. I think there's a reasonable prospect that artificial intelligence is going to accelerate scientific progress by a factor of 3 or 5 or 10. I think it's a reasonable prospect that energy is going to become not free, but fairly close to free. I think we're going to make staggering progress in the life sciences, and I think the odds are 50-50 that my granddaughter will live to be 100, whereas the odds for me are far, far less than that. I think there are going to be capacities to engage and interact with machines that are quite unlike anything we have seen before. So I think we're headed into a quite extraordinary period technologically. Now, it's a deep historical question. It's also true that during my grandmother's lifetime, we saw 2 world wars and a depression, and we didn't see anything really like that during my lifetime. And how related were those 2 world wars and depression to all that technological progress and change? I don't know the answer to that question, but there may be some relation. And certainly a lot of the political reactions we're seeing suggest that overly rapid change can be quite problematic. But I think that things always take longer to happen than you think they will. People were being put in autonomously driven vehicles and driven up Route 101 in California from San Jose to San Francisco in 2014 and announcing that all the truck driver jobs would be gone soon. It's 10 years later and roughly no chauffeurs or truck drivers have been fired because of autonomous vehicles. So I think these things always tend to take a bit longer than you think they will, but then they happen faster than you thought they could. And so I don't think that Jay Powell ought to be thinking about artificial intelligence and productivity growth as he makes monetary policy over the next several years. But I sure think the next president of the United States ought to be thinking about maybe we should have paid a little more attention to the public policy frameworks around social media as they were being developed. And we need to think very hard about that with respect to artificial intelligence. But I think that there's something quite extraordinary about AI. Electricity is great, but just because you have electricity, you don't have more electricity. Just because you have fire doesn't mean you have more fire. But if you have good enough AI, it starts making even better AI. And that recursive aspect is potentially something that is quite extraordinary. You know, here's a history. Here's a 60-second history of mankind, economic history of mankind. From the beginning of time until 3000 BC, there was no growth, none. From 3000 BC till 1500, there maybe was some growth, like 0.02% a year. So growth rose 2 or 3% over a century. From 1500 to 1850, the growth rate rose to be about 20 basis points, 0.2% a year. And then we had the Industrial Revolution, and so it's incredibly fast. I had somebody do a calculation the other day. 7% of all the human beings who have ever been alive are alive today. 75% of the GDP, 75% of the GDP that mankind has ever produced has been produced during my lifetime. And over the next 50 years, there'll be 3 times as much, 2.5 times as much produced as has been produced so far.
This is with or without AI?
This is with it. This is even on a relatively modest assumption about AI.
Okay.
And if that process, 0 to 2 basis points to 20 basis points to 2%, maybe we'll get another major discontinuity with AI. If I had to make a bet on what a history book in 2400 will say about the first third of the 21st century, I don't think it'll be about China versus the US or Russia having a war with Ukraine or the Middle East going hooey or America electing a demagogue as president. I think it'll be about this was the moment when intelligence that was much like human intelligence came to be a feature of something other than humans. So I think this has got with better than even chance, is really immensely important.
We have some questions here that are stacking up that I'd love to do a lightning round and to get some quick answers to a handful of questions.
Okay.
Number 1, do you see Bitcoin becoming mainstream ever?
No, I don't know what the real use. There's a use case which is it's paper gold, so it's a different kind of gold that you can hold as a kind of ultimate store of value, and that'll be there, and it's really fantastic for all sorts of crime. It's money laundering, all kinds of things. Financial privacy. If you like it, you call it financial privacy. If you don't like it, you call it hiding the fruits of your crime. And it's sort of the same thing. And so I think it'll always be around, but I think the blockchain will be profoundly important, but I don't think it's ever going to be, I think it's going to, in the economic history of the world, where will the credit card fit? It's a meaningful, significant innovation, but it's not a seismic event in the economic history of the world. I think crypto will be 35% of the size of the credit card as an innovation in the history of the world.
Okay. How do you solve the debt crisis?
Which debt crisis?
For the U.S.
Which debt crisis? Our budget deficit? Our budget deficit?
I mean, it sounds like we might be able to grow out of it if AI really is that big, but...
Maybe. I wouldn't count on that. Look, we're going to have to pay more. Look, the government's got to spend more than it used to, because what's the government do? It takes care of old people, and we got vastly more old people relative to young people. It buys services, and the price of services has gone way up relative to the price of goods. It pays interest, and there's a lot more debt than there used to be. It defends us, and we got much bigger national security threats than we used to have. So government is going to have to be bigger than we're used to having it be, whatever your values are, which means we're going to have to pay more taxes than we used to have to be. And borrowing the money is a way of postponing that, not a way of avoiding that. So ultimately, taxes will be higher than they are today.
What's your view on stagflation? Has it changed?
I thought we pursued irresponsible policies at the end of the pandemic that were going to cause inflation, and I turned out to be completely right. I would say I thought that we were ultimately not going to get inflation gone without having a significant recession. And it's looking like I was too pessimistic in having that view, in part because I extrapolated from the 60s and the 70s, and there we didn't figure it out and do the right thing for a decade. And here we delayed for a year. And I was so excited about how bad the delay was that I lost a little perspective on a year versus 10 years. And in the 70s, we were unlucky. We caught all kinds of supply shocks. And after we pushed inflation up, we were lucky. China went into deflation. Oil turned out, for various reasons, to be glutted. And so we got some good luck. So I think stagflation is further odds off than I would have guessed 2 years ago.
Have we hit the soft landing? Where are we?
You know, we're kind of headed down, and the weather's pretty good. The weather's reasonably clear, and the pilot's made some mistakes before, so you can't be sure the pilot won't make another mistake. And, you know, there's this Cucamonga who might turn out to take over the pilot's chair. And if he does, and that happens before you're securely on the ground, it could be pretty bad, but it looks a bunch better than it did before.
I do have to ask about the election. We'll get there. Private equity, what percentage of the economy is it going to be?
I think it's turning it. I think it'll probably continue to rise a little bit because it kind of makes sense that having people who are sort of highly motivated to pay attention, monitoring investments, probably works better than having people who aren't highly motivated to monitor investments, overlooking companies. And it's turned out, for reasons that business schools figured out, and markets aren't perfectly efficient, but they're pretty efficient. So it's a good idea to put your money in the S&P 500. But if your money's in the S&P 500 and then it's in an S&P 500 company and you kind of have to stay in it no matter what, you're not going to be all that motivated to fix the company. And so I think there'll be some sets of pressures towards some increase in the size of private equity. But my guess is that private equity is not going to my guess is that the world currently overassesses the return to private equity because the world thinks that it's not volatile because nobody reports a price that moves every day, but actually it probably is kind of volatile. And not reporting a price every day sort of works out really well when all the downturns are followed by upturns. But when the downturns are followed by more downturn, then it kind of ends up disastrous. And since private equity got invented, we haven't really had any sustained downturn. But sustained downturns are a thing that happens in random walks. It happened in the United States from 1966 to 1982. It happens in Europe. It's happened a ton in Europe and in other parts of the world. So I think that private equity is not as good an investment as people in general think it is. And sooner or later, people will figure that out. And when they do, that'll slow its growth. So it'll probably get bigger, but probably not at a huge rate.
Okay, let's get to the election. You're not supposed to predict what's going to happen, except that we kind of have two scenarios, right? You have one candidate talking about raising tariffs, talking about it. What he actually does is one thing, but that's one scenario. You have another candidate who's talking about raising capital gains tax. Don't really know exactly what kind of economic leader she would be. What's your best take on like the reality? Either way this goes, what do you think we're looking at for
I've been very
economic leadership?
Look, I've been very critical of the excessively large stimulus. I thought that some of the stuff that's been said about gouging and price controls is just nutty. Some of the stuff that's been said in terms of relieving all the debt, student loan debt, medical debt, just kind of go relieve debt for people who want debt relieved, I don't really think is very rational as policy. I think the idea of calling it a billionaire's tax and then taxing unrealized capital gains for people who don't have any cash because they didn't realize their capital gains is kind of a bad idea. So I think there are a lot of problems with things that the Democrats and in general and Kamala Harris in particular have said. That said, I think there is no comparison in terms of the risks to the economy between the two candidates. I think that the Trump tariffs are much worse, much higher than Smoot-Hawley was, and are gonna be significantly inflationary, are going to make our exports much less competitive because lots of what we import goes into what we export, and its cost will go way up, will impair our exports further when other countries retaliate, as they surely will, and will create a much more unstable and fragmented world. I think that having a president who says that we need to have the dollar go down and we need to have the Fed be more political is a prescription for higher inflation expectations, and that's a prescription for higher inflation. I think cutting off and trying to deport 11 million people is beyond whatever its moral consequences are, is a prescription for labor shortages and substantial wage inflation. And I think having a president who talks about punishing his enemies, sending people to court, sending people to jail because they disagree with him, undermines the sanctity of contract and the rule of law, which is the reason why a given asset in the United States is much more valuable than the same asset in most other countries. And so I think it's profoundly risky, and I don't think there's any real comparison in terms of a best guess economic scenario between the two candidates. And I think there's one other point that's worth making for people who, I think what I've said is sufficient, but there's some people who think that the left-wing stuff is crazier and the right-wing stuff isn't quite as crazy. And so they kind of are more in a plague on both their houses place. And the thing I'd say to those people is, if Donald Trump wins, the odds are 75 or 80% that he will control both the Senate and the House. And so he'll actually be in a position to legislate all his craziness. And given the way the polling looks in the Senate in particular, if the Democrats win, it's really not actually that likely that they will have control. That's a problem in some ways because it'll make it difficult to get a legislative agenda done. But if you think there's a lot of danger in a lot of the policies they're proposing, there's much more brakes that's likely to be present if we have a Democratic administration than if we have a Republican administration going forward. And that also operates to contain possible risks.
Gotcha. So let's bring it back to businesses then, because a lot of people think, Congress, politicians, they don't get enough done. They're not solving enough social problems. Businesses need to take a role. That's an argument. What is your charge for business leaders today, in just given the economy, given the pandemic that we've gone through, given some level of governmental inaction on some pending issues? Like, what do you advise people who come to you for advice for?
So let me answer that at two levels. One is, I often say to business people call me all the time and they say, I'm going to Washington, I'm going to have a meeting with the Deputy Secretary of Commerce. Do you have any advice as to what I should say and how I should handle my meeting with the Deputy Secretary of Commerce? And I say, well, number one, you might want to consider asking the Deputy Secretary of Commerce how you can help them, like you would with any other customer, rather than just telling the Deputy Secretary of Commerce how they can help you. Number two, you might recognize that the Deputy Secretary of Commerce actually has a charge to care about all the American people, not just you. So the statement that a tax cut for your industry will help your industry will not be regarded as dispositive by the Deputy Secretary of Commerce that it is a good idea. Number three, the fact that you're a CEO is not regarded in Washington as meaning you're omniscient. And so if they ask you a question, you should kind of know the answer. And you should have somebody ask you the hard questions about your position before you go, so that when you're asked them, you don't pound the table louder and speak louder and say you're a CEO. So that's my advice about how to be a business person approaching Washington. But I think you're asking a somewhat different question, how to be a kind of responsible business leader in the context of the broader society. So I think the first thing I'd say is it starts with the stuff that's fully under your control. Maybe you should do something about climate change. Maybe you should do something about education in your city. Maybe you should fight poverty. But how about first, we're not going to contribute large sums of money in ways that try to subvert the political system to get rifle shot legislation passed for the benefit of our company. How about number two, we're gonna make sure as best we can that we're in compliance with reasonable rules and regulations that are applied to our company. And we're gonna treat that as an important cultural thing that we try to do here at our company. How about number three, we're going to use our influence to address the broad national interest rather than just specific issues that are just about our company. And number four, when we try to do socially oriented things, we're going to try to think about the full system consequences of the things that we do. rather than just what they kind of mean for our business. And that's probably the thing where I think economists tend to think much more clearly than, frankly, a lot of business people do. I mean, I have heard so many people say, I'm caricaturing it a bit, but I'm not caricaturing it completely. The teachers' unions are terrible. We just need much more choice. We need much more charter schools. We just need to get rid of the teachers. Get rid of those damn teachers' unions. I started a charter school. We gave money to the charter school. We hired the best teachers away from the public schools because we paid 20% more, and we chose the best teachers. And then we said kids could apply, but their parents had to promise to come to all the PTA meetings, and we got a bunch of good kids. And we screened them. If they weren't doing their homework, if they weren't sticking with it, if their parents weren't showing them up, we kicked them out. And we had 400 kids in our kindergarten, and we only had 162 kids in our 5th grade. But you know what? Between our kindergarten and our 5th grade, our kids showed 3 times as much achievement growth as the kids in the public schools. And so we're really geniuses, and we just need to do what we did. And it doesn't occur to them that every single bit of what they did on their evidence was done at the expense of somebody else. They took the good teachers out of the other schools and put them in their school. They took the best kids. They didn't keep the best kids. Every single bit of it was winning a zero-sum game. And if when business leaders thought about the good they were doing, they applied some discipline of system-wide analysis rather than just my story, it would lead them to be more ultimately moral and successful actors. Now look, you can take I once gave this speech, I once gave this thing, and somebody who's kind of clever said, well, that's interesting, Larry, that's a good argument. Suppose Harvard was trying to recruit a really good economist from the University of Colorado. And somebody said to you, that guy's going to do good at Harvard. He'll help Harvard and he'll be good, but he's really unique and extraordinary at the University of Colorado. And so you're really screwing things up. He'd be much more useful at the University of Colorado, so aren't you doing an immoral thing by taking him away? And shouldn't you not try? Harvard's already got plenty, so maybe Harvard shouldn't try to improve.
The margin.
And I said, no, that's crazy. And there is some tension between the two things that I've said. I do understand that. But I think that there's not that much tension. And I think ultimately you should compete in your sphere. And if you're trying to go outside of your sphere, you should think hard about what the systemic consequences of whatever you're doing are. That'd be my advice.
I have 2 more. We can maybe do these lightning round-ish because we're coming to the end of our time. But on this topic, one question is: when a company has a moral failure, is it on the conscience of the shareholders or the management team at a company?
Some of both. I mean,
you brought up accountability.
Look, a question that I've thought a lot about that I don't have good answers to. I think a kind of quite hard social problem is, what do you do about companies that mess up? You can fine them, but it's not like who pays the fine? Like a bunch of people some of whom own the stock today, most of the people who owned the stock when they did the stuff has sold the stock already. So who exactly are you punishing? You can put them out of business, but maybe Boeing deserves to be put out of business, but it doesn't seem like it would be very good for the United States if Boeing did go out of business. You can fire the management, but then you got to think about who your new management's going to be, and maybe the government will be good at picking new management, but not clear the government's really going to be very good at taking over the company. So I think there's a very deep problem, which actually I think scholars of business should devote more attention to, which is how do you deal with business failure? And there's really two parts of it that I blurred together in answering it, which is moral failure, businesses that kind of committed a crime or violated regulations in some major way, and businesses that are in really important spheres that just ran themselves badly and became inept. And it's a really hard problem. I was the sort of person reporting to President Obama who oversaw our team that was on a daily basis managing the automobile bailout. And I think we did a pretty good job of responding to essential companies that had sort of screwed themselves up and also caught a very bad break with the recession. But it was hard to do. There were some tough decisions about what we should try to decide and what we should leave to them. It was pretty complicated. And I think we did okay, but it's not that the government would have had the capacity to have managed 4 of those situations at once in a competent way. So how do you deal with business, with bad business, either in the criminal legal sense of it or in the other thing? I don't think enough thought is given by scholars to turning things around. And you could say the same thing about, there's a terrible school. Well, we should close the damn school because it's terrible. Well, that's fine, but there are a bunch of kids who walk to that school and don't have parents who can drive them anywhere. So if you close that school, like where are the kids going to go to school? So I think there's some really hard problems in the world about failing and failed institutions and how you turn them around that I haven't seen enough good work that tries to think about that problem conceptually and then looks at a range of practical cases.
Let's stay on this idea of scholarship and work to find better practices going forward. We're at this institute. You have students in the audience, you have professors in the audience, you have researchers, you have administrators, you have business people. I mean, if you were a younger economist, what would you be excited to dig into at a place like this? What's your hope for this kind of work going forward? And we can make this the last question.
So I probably gave you the question that feels to me most important relative to the quality of thought that sort of exists about it. I mean, I'm not saying anything that's not in the newspapers when I say that Intel is America's only major semiconductor company and is a complete mess. How should the broader society deal with that? I don't feel like I know the answer, and whereas with respect to lots of questions where I don't know, if I had a question about immigration policy, I wouldn't know the answer necessarily, but I would know 3 people I could call who could give me a lot of good thinking on the topic. I don't even know who I would call to talk about that question. So that's one example. I think the question you raised earlier about organizational forms and which ones work and what happens when you've got multiple organizational forms coexisting is a thing that is under research. There's some interesting studies looking at elder care facilities that are not-for-profit and run by private equity. But I think there's a lot more work that could be done very usefully in that kind of sphere. I think that the set of questions around spurring technological change are really important. Operation Warp Speed worked pretty well, but the effort to get the stuff disseminated around the world actually worked pretty badly. What are the lessons of that episode for next time. Everybody
maybe-
calls for Manhattan projects all the time on all kinds of things. They never really work. Most of them, except for the Manhattan project, don't work very well. I think there's a question that I've always wondered about. How do you make business collaborations work better? Everybody always says that we should have more collaboration because, in the semiconductor industry or in the electric car industry, why should you have 3 different companies doing the same laboratory work separately? Let's organize some kind of collaboration. I don't know whether you'd agree with this or not. Bob, you and I worked together on some collaborations between MIT and Harvard. I think one of them that we did has turned out, because it had a remarkable leader, to have been really quite successful. But there was stuff that happened that was really interesting that I didn't see coming in advance, though I should have. We had this thing that was joint between MIT and Harvard. I thought the thing was really good. We'd see a donor who was excited, who was excited to do something, and I would think the donor, maybe we should send the donor over to see that person, to see this terrific collaboration between Harvard and MIT. Everybody else thought it was a terrible idea to send the donor to that person. We should send the donor to do something that was all for Harvard. And when there was a question as to where people should be allocated, where faculty should go, well, let's not share them with MIT. We can share some, but not our best ones, with MIT. And I dare say the same incentives operated at MIT. And so how do you organize successful collaborations is another question, and actually make them work is another question that I think is very important. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop, is I don't think we know enough about history here. The interstate, when we built highways, in real terms, the interstate highway system, when we were building it in the 60s and 70s, a mile of road, adjusting for inflation, adjusting for wage levels, everything, cost about 60% as much as it does now. Why is that? And what can we do about it? So I think there's a lot in sort of implementation that I would talk about. I'll give you one final example to keep in mind because it's sort of haunted me since I was told about it. It cost $750 million, and it took 4 years to build the Golden Gate Bridge, measured in today's dollars. In 2013, a decision was made that it would be a good idea to put suicide nets attached to the Golden Gate Bridge underneath it. Putting suicide nets in took 6 years, longer, and cost $500 million, 2/3 as much as building the whole bridge. Now, was that the public sector's fault? Was that the businesses who did its fault? I don't know exactly, but it sure doesn't seem like that's how it ought to be. So the set of questions around implementation and getting things done that involve more than one actor would be a final thing that I would highlight for research. But God, you guys have a great and important mission, and I really envy it. I really envy you having that mission, and I'm really grateful to have had the chance to talk with you tonight.
We've been really grateful to have you and your voice.
Thank you so much, Curt. Thank you, Lawrence, for this. I just want to if we could raise a toast. May we collaborate and do things efficiently. Thank you for your conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. And we look forward to continued engagement.